Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Welcome back to another installment on saving storytelling. I have spent a great deal of time on this channel talking about the failings of modern storytelling, and to balance that, I try and spend a lot of time also speaking about good stories that I have experienced and the techniques and methods that I use as I attempt to create good stories myself. I do this not as a master of the art of storytelling, but as a journeyman who is recording his struggles attempting to master the art form in the hopes that other people may find it useful as they themselves gather the techniques and the knowledge necessary to become master storytellers. And also in the belief that discussing your approach to storytelling with other people, even in the somewhat removed format of YouTube or even a blog, will prompt discussions and revelations that allow me to improve my own craft through feedback and critique. So today I wanted to talk about that in the context of the theory of storytelling. This does not directly relate to my video on what a story is, although if you want to go back and watch that, a little bit of that will inform what we discuss here. Instead, my theory of storytelling is just a very narrow application of the theory of communication that I learned about when I was a freshman in college. Now, not everyone was a freshman communications major, and if you did take a basic introduction to communications class, odds are you may have slept through it, for which I don't blame you at all. Outside of what we are about to discuss, I struggle to remember much of anything that I learned in my introduction to communications class. And if we're honest, I may have spent more time doodling in that class than I spent actually listening to the teacher. Unfortunately, many freshman classes are just make work, and they can be kind of boring. You don't get to the interesting stuff until later, which completely bypasses the question of whether you even need to study in college for communications or not. Not actually a question in the scope of this video. We'll come back to that at a later time. Maybe. My point is, there was one part of this class that I took a great deal of interest in, and that I still remember today, and that is the basic theory of communication. It goes something like the graph you see here on your screen. Communication begins, so the theory goes, with a message. That message is then encoded by a sender, it is transmitted to a receiver, who then decodes it and understands the message. In the most basic of interpretations, then, we could say that I have a message, which is the subject of this video. I am encoding it using my voice and words, and then I am transmitting it to you over the internet. You hear it and decode the words and understand the ideas that I had when I recorded it. Pretty simple stuff, almost intuitive. However, it applies to a shocking number of interactions in life. In fact, as theories go, you might say it explains too much. It might be too broad to really be useful. This is why I have the theory of storytelling, a theory that helps me dial in these very abstract concepts in a way that makes the analysis of a story easier to do. So, when you apply this theory to storytelling, you would say, there is a series of events that one person wants to share with another. That person, the storyteller, then creates a narrative using a series of narrative techniques. He then shares that narrative through a medium to another person who hears those techniques and interprets them in order to understand the story, to the extent that he can then share it with another person. Now, why is this important? Well, the short answer is because the way you think about a thing influences the conclusions you will draw. Previously, I have discussed the concept of critical theory on this channel, specifically in a video I did on Anita Sarkeesian, who analyzes all media through the lens of critical theory. If you want a longer recap on critical theory, I would recommend going back and watching that video. For our purposes now, critical theory is a way of thinking about storytelling that is entirely about the stage of storytelling where the audience receives the story and decodes it. In other words, critical theory is an approach to storytelling that is entirely about audience interpretation. Now, medium is a part of this theory that is very difficult to discuss in particular. Medium can be anything from a novel versus a movie to one genre versus another. The medium of a science fiction story is very different from the medium of a spy thriller, for example. What makes this particularly challenging is that the very things that are useful in one medium can be very difficult or even harmful in another medium. The very condensed, high information use of panels in a comic book can be antithetical to good storytelling in a novel, which wants to explore its ideas and characters in a much more relaxed pace. The frantic thrill-a-minute tempo of a thriller story and the very laid-back, often lackadaisical pacing of a romantic comedy are very much at odds. Now, some mediums, like movies or novels, are suited to tell a wide variety of stories. Genres, on the other hand, have very specific storytelling conventions baked into them. Nevertheless, they are important things to consider, as they are part of how you manage the expectations your audience brings to the table when decoding your story. Fortunately, most mediums of story have extensive thought and time put into analyzing them already. You can find a book on the best way to make a film. You can find a book on the best way to draw a comic book. And not just a book, but many books. Many people have recorded their thoughts on this matter and placed them at your disposal. The series of events that make up the message of your story are probably the easiest thing to put together and the hardest thing to get right. A plot needs to be thought out, consistent, and either meaningful or interesting, and ideally both, in order to really grab and hold your audience. Again, the best way to construct a plot is something that is well covered in other places. Whether it's John Campbell's Monomyth or Blake Snyder's Save the Cat, there are tons of people out there telling you how to construct a good plot. If you want something more contemporary and up-to-date, you don't have to look any further than people like Mahler and the EFAP crew to find people who spend hours and hours every week just looking at plots and how they are constructed. Finally, there is encoding that you use to build your story and create the narrative through line before you encase it in its medium. Now, it's true that some narrative techniques work better in some mediums than others. For example, color symbolism is a narrative technique, and it happens to be one that my professor in college was particularly fond of. You can find it in prose, you can find it in comic books, you can find it in movies. However, there are also some places where you probably won't find it. You won't find it on your newspaper funny pages. You won't find it in black and white comic books like manga, because these mediums do not include color. That makes the use of color symbolism very difficult. So while you may have to re-evaluate narrative techniques if you are changing medium, or if you realize that your medium is not well suited to a technique you wish to use, in my experience, which is essentially what this theory of storytelling is founded on, those kinds of hurdles are overcome in the transmission of a story through medium, not so much in the process of encoding that story by the storyteller. You could think of this as a part of editing rather than as a part of writing. And my problem with discussing narrative techniques is that, unlike everything else I have covered, it doesn't seem to be something people do a great deal of, at least in the modern storytelling environment. Narrative techniques run a very wide gamut, from foreshadowing to symbolism, color or otherwise, to literary allusion, to jokes, to the construction of prose and wordplay, and of course a host of other things which we don't have a space to discuss here. I find this lack of discussion of these kinds of techniques very odd. Now, it's true that every storyteller is going to find some techniques easier to use than others, and you may just have to sift through a bunch of techniques before you find what works best for you. But something that I would have found very helpful when constructing my own methods of storytelling is a place where I could find someone discussing all the available techniques of storytelling and analyzing the good and bad things about them. That way, rather than constantly reinventing the wheel to make new techniques and then trying to implement them myself, I could have drawn on the know-how of other authors, more skilled authors, who would discuss these things at length. And yet, where treatises on how to construct a plot, or how to analyze a story through a particular lens, or even how to transmit your story through a specific medium abound, a catalog of narrative devices doesn't really seem to exist outside of perhaps TV tropes, which is not the most useful reference document out there, and also doesn't organize these ideas in ways that make them very easy to examine from all angles. I think a big part of why this is just because no one has analyzed storytelling from this specific theory, from the theory of communications. Everyone is thinking about the ideas, or the plot, in other words, or how the audience is going to react to them. The closest we get to thinking about the techniques we use to impart those ideas is a discussion of genre and medium, which is unfortunate. I think more discussion of literary techniques would really improve abilities people to implement those techniques in a way that is not so cookie cutter. And that is one of the big problems we have in storytelling right now, a cookie cutter implementation of techniques. So discussion of storytelling techniques, discussion of prose and narrative is something that I hope to continue to dig into. But at the same time, I hope that sharing this theory of storytelling with you will also give you a lens with which you can look at your own storytelling and try and find the place where you are weakest. Right now, I find my weakest point in storytelling to be medium. I often want to buck the conventions of whatever storytelling device I am working in, whether it be comics or prose, or even the construction of these videos, which, let's face it, are not typical for YouTube. And I think that's something that I really need to work on. Now, I'm not saying you have to use this theory of storytelling. I just think it's useful to have as many lenses to look at a problem through as possible. And hopefully, someone out there will be able to benefit from mine. But even if you aren't helped by this lens, I would still like to hear about your approaches to studying storytelling down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.